You are always writing things that are getting the right people angry. And you have your latest piece is Non-Site, and you wrote that with Walter Ben Michaels, and it's about the problem of the disparity discourse. Can you tell us what made you write that piece?
Sure. I mean, I've been writing somewhere between critical and reflective pieces about disparity discourse since 2012. My friend and colleague Merlin Chalquinian and I, who's a public health professor at Columbia, did an article in 2012 in the Socialist Register called Race Class Crisis, and it was an examination of the limits of the discourse of racial disparity then. The main argument is, well, that there are two basic metrics of justice or social justice. One of them is what political scientist Preston Smith calls the discourse of racial disparity, or the norm of racial disparity, which basically boils down to radically understood equality of opportunity. And according to that norm, the society would be just if, say, Black people, but other designated groups occupied different rungs of the social, political, and economic hierarchy in percentages that were roughly equivalent, más o menos, to their proportion in the general population, right? So that's the principle of racial democracy. The principle of social democracy focuses on overall inequality, right? And the gap between the rich and the capitalist class and everybody else. And in principle, either of them is a defensible norm of justice. And as a number of people argue, a lot of people arguing now, that they aren't mutually exclusive. And it's true, they are not logically mutually exclusive, but they aren't dependent on each other either, right? And in Black politics, for instance, as Preston Smith has argued and shown, from the mid-1930s to roughly like the end of the 1960s, Black politics was driven by, or was anchored to both norms, right? Both the norm of racial democracy and the norm of social democracy. And because they were so closely tied together practically, and by the way, one of the reasons that they were was that the people who were most likely to support racial democratic ideals were also leftists, right? So, and because they seemed to coincide more than coexist for so long, it just became natural for people to think that they're basically like two versions of the same thing, but they aren't. And what we've argued, and what Merlin Chalquinian and I have argued, and what I've argued, and what Walter's argued, is that increasingly over the last 40 to 50 years, what we see is that the ideal of racial democracy, which undergirds the focus on disparity as the main metric of inequality for concern, has preempted, displaced, eaten, pushed aside, murdered in the womb, the principle of social democracy. And what we have said repeatedly is that the fundamental problem with the racial democratic ideal is that it assumes whatever the hierarchical structure of the society is, and insists that Blacks just be their appropriate percentage of the goods and bads, right? I mean, there was a Black Power minister in the late 1960s who argued actually that freedom would be when Black people were 12% of everything, from the corporate boardrooms to the homeless. Well, and as the society has become steadily more unequal in the 40 years of neoliberalism, basically, the gap between the rich and the powerful and everybody else is growing steadily. So, in fact, one of the points we make in the Non-Site piece is that the racial wealth gap ultimately pales in comparison to the class gap, right? That is the difference in the percentage of national wealth and income that's owned by the top 1% of the population, or even top 1/10 of 1% of the population, and all of the rest of us. And what we do in the Non-Site piece is we take a sort of cold, sober eye to three of the domains in which disparities discourse is most prominent currently. One, which I'd written about before, again with Merlin, actually, in a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, as well as the Common Dreams essay, is the mischief, the potential for mischief that a focus on the racial disparity as an explanation for even what is apparently, the case that Blacks are more vulnerable to serious illness and death from COVID-19 than the general population. That not going beyond the focus on racial disparity doesn't help us understand the causation, doesn't help us figure out what to do about it, and worst of all, can feed into the toxic cesspool of racial medicine that's always lying beneath the surface, like in the medical field. Basically. So we look at that. We look at the wealth gap, and we examine the racial disparities in police killings.